Recorded live from Hong Kong and Toronto. Let's go! This is the PR and Law Podcast.
The PR and Law Podcast.
Turn it up. With your hosts, Cam McMurchie and Uen Christie.
Welcome to episode number 16 already of the PR and Law Podcast. I'm your co-host, Cam McMurchie, alongside Uen Christie.
Hello, Cameron.
Uen is an employment lawyer and partner at Duntroon LLP in Toronto, Canada, and you can find his firm online at duntroonllp.law. I'm a PR guy based in Hong Kong and publisher of the Digital Bits PR and Communications newsletter, and you can find that at digitalbitspr.com. If you enjoy the podcast, please tell a friend, and you can follow us on social media as well at LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. You can find us there at PR Law Podcast, all one word. And we're also on YouTube. You can subscribe to our YouTube channel and listen that way. We'd also love your support on Patreon. That would mean a lot. You can go to our show website at prlawpodcast.com and click support the show. And we will take your questions at hashtag PRLawPod. So if you want to ask Uen or me a question, phrase that, put it onto social media and tag it PR Law Pod, and we will set aside some time on a future show to go over those. We have all sorts of stuff to talk about this week. Uen, what's happening with you?
Well, Cam, you talked about questions. Funny enough, I've been getting a lot of questions the last few weeks. As you may have seen, some of our COVID numbers have been starting to spike again up here in Canada.
Yeah, what happened?
It's been really interesting through the. Yeah, well, we started opening up, and obviously, if you open up, numbers are going to go up. I think there's obviously a clear correlation there, and that's to be expected. But it's sort of prompted a lot of questions, a lot of calls from clients for the last few weeks in particular. People again, starting to ask me, do I have to go back to work? Right? As a lot of employers are reopening, they're asking their employees to come back, which is a good thing. This is what we want to happen, right? But a lot of employees are calling me up and saying, I just don't feel safe. I don't want to get sick. Do I have to go back? And look, Cam, this is an issue everywhere where this is happening. Employees that need to return to work and might feel unsafe. But generally speaking, the answer is, you got to go back to work. I get a lot of people have taken to working from home, myself included. But, unless you can sort of demonstrate that it's dangerous or there's some undue hazard in returning, people have to go back to work,
This is kind of funny in a way because, people are working from home. Obviously, we found out, I think in a lot of industries, it's fine working from home. You can actually get a lot done and it's a lot more convenient. You skip a commute potentially, all of that sort of stuff. And plus you work with maybe fewer distractions, although it depends how many people are in the house with you. But after getting used to that and getting into that routine, I can see how, especially if there was a long commute or something with it, it's going to be very difficult to go back to that because you think, why? If I could get everything done from home, why do I have to do this big inconvenient thing to get the work done when it appears unnecessary in many cases?
Well, yeah. And, I don't want to jump too far ahead. Later in the show, I want to talk about a fantastic article I read on just this point called The Great Reset and how, we've completely reframed the economic framework and how we work and how we're going to work in the future. So we'll get to that later in the show. But yeah, again, from this sort of stuff always changes from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. But, across Canada, generally speaking, the threshold for whether or not you have to go back is somewhere in the range of, is there undue hazard? Is there danger? It can't be merely the risk of getting sick. And even if you're comfortable at home, that's not a good enough excuse. And I was looking into some of the law in the US around this, and generally speaking, it's the same. States like California and New York, you have a right to refuse unsafe work. But, unless you can demonstrate that, you have to go back. Mm-hmm. That's just the way that it works. So now again, these situations are always examined on a case by case basis, like all of these issues, right? So, if you have a particular disability or or a particular medical illness that precludes you from returning to the environment, those are very, very legitimate reasons not to go back. Perhaps, you have childcare issues that you don't have access to childcare because, schools and daycares, preschools, what have you, remain closed. Those are reasons upon which you can be accommodated. But, outside of sort of these unique areas, you have to go back if your employer requests you to go back. And, you could be in some deep trouble if you don't. I mean, in most provinces in the country, if you refuse to go back when your employer asks you, it could be construed as an abandonment of your position, which effectively is equivalent to having been fired. But abandonment, of course, where it's sort of different, you could forfeit your right to, unemployment insurance or employment insurance benefits. And really, we don't want to get into those sorts of situations.
Yeah, people should know, if the boss says you're working at 9:00 Monday morning in the office and you don't go in, there's going to be a problem. I mean, pandemic or not, it's kind of what you have to do, especially if the caseloads are getting better and people are going back and it seems to be safer. You're right. I can see how it's difficult to make an argument that it's too dangerous. I mean, here it's sort of been the other way. I mean, I mentioned last week in Hong Kong that I am working from home again. And it's a new thing because we've had over 100 cases for 5, 6, 7 days in a row now. And each day the case number, the number of cases is higher and higher, which is a bad sign. And it's interesting because I actually do prefer working at home. So in one sense, I thought, this is awful for Hong Kong to be going through this now. And people are getting sick and we're seeing more deaths here as well. But I do kind of prefer working from home by the same token. But all I remember was last time I worked from home for several weeks and then went back into the office. I did enjoy going back in because it was a little more social. I could go down and, buy a coffee at Starbucks, walk around, I felt a little more part of society than I do when I'm at home, because otherwise I could go many hours without stepping outside, just working from home. So it's going to be a transition as people, this whole COVID experiment, there's going to be so many sort of knock-on effects as a result of all of it for us to deal with. And working from home and then going back to work is just one of them.
Yeah. And I think we have to start to think outside the box in this regard. It's not really an either or scenario, or at least it shouldn't be. It shouldn't be either I have to work from home or I have to work from the office. I mean, there's no reason why we can't have some combination of both. And, I know that a lot of my employer clients are looking at moving to sort of rotating office schedules where they're trying to, limit the number of offices they have and just have workers come in a couple days a week and rotate. And I think that that's a really, really smart idea. First of all, it cuts costs for employers, so that's fantastic. You can occupy a smaller office space. Your rent is lower, your overhead is lower. Perhaps the number of administrative personnel you require on site or even off site drops. I mean, these are really, really good economic and financial benefits to employers who are trying to get lean right now. And I can tell you, I feel like I have some sort of symbiotic connection and relationship to what's going on in terms of the ebbs and flows of COVID, because depending on the week, I'm getting a lot of calls from clients either to start putting together termination notices, or I'm getting calls from employees who have been terminated. And then some employers in some contexts are starting to bring people back, which is great, and are looking to hire people in unique sectors. So again, really there has to be some flexibility in terms of these approaches from the employer's perspective and the employee's perspective. And we have to start to think outside the box. Again, just wanted to quickly go back to sort of my initial point about the refusals. The follow-up question I always get is, well, okay, I have to go back, but, I really don't think that it's safe. I really don't think that my employer is doing everything that they can to maintain a safe work environment. Well, again, that's fine. I mean, most provinces and, a number of jurisdictions in the States, there's a framework for how to deal with that, right? You can bring in an officer to investigate the work environment to make sure that it is in fact safe, that your employer is providing access to PPE, that there's social distancing. There is a framework to ensure that your employer is doing their part under the law in this regard. But, there has to be some flexibility. We can't just have this rigid approach, regardless of what that approach may be.
And these frameworks are not new. I mean, they've been in place for a very long time. Of course, always, not just because of COVID-19. You have to go to a safe workplace. And if you don't feel safe, then there's channels to raise that. So it's been consistent, I think, all the way through. I want to say on a related note, though, I don't know if I've said it on this show, but this is something I've repeated over and over. And when I finally write my manifesto, this is going to be a chapter inside that manifesto. And it does pertain to work, because I get so frustrated with the working all the time. Actually, it's not that working all the time that bothers me. I think we may have talked about this before. I mean, we both work in jobs where there's a lot of demand, and sometimes that demand doesn't fit nicely between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. There's a lot of conference calls on nights and weekends, or client meetings in your case, which obviously is a lot of work. We're given areas of responsibility, and we have to deliver on those responsibilities, which is fantastic. What I'm seeking, what I think employers should consider, and employees, and work on this together, is sort of what you touched on, which is more of a loose kind of framework of a schedule when you have to be somewhere physically. Because there are times when, for instance, I'm working late on a Friday night. I mean, last night, we're recording this Sunday night, Hong Kong time. I had a 3.5 hour conference call late on Saturday night that went past midnight with my employer, which is fine. I actually don't mind doing that. Sometimes we're called upon to do that. But then if we're all in the office on Tuesday and I have a friend in town for one day and I would like to go meet him for a long lunch or to go have a pint in the afternoon because it's not busy at work, I would like the flexibility to do that. And I think a lot of places, especially on this side of the world, I think it's a little more involved on your side of the world, but probably not to this degree. There has to be a better understanding of just you're responsible for delivering A, B, and C on time, and how you manage your time as a result of that is kind of up to you. And then work on the frameworks of, do you need to be physically there for meetings and all of these sorts of things. But I think this sort of give and take is a lot better, because at the moment, a lot of staff are required to be in the office for a lot of hours and then work on their own time as well. And I think that's taking a bit too much.
Yeah, I mean, look, you're right. You're absolutely right, and I certainly deal with this a lot in the legal profession, as we've talked about before. Our profession historically has been slow to change, slow to progress. In many facets of the legal profession, we continue to sort of subscribe to this very antiquated notion of business. And I think, the pandemic has been a really, really sort of critical kick in the ass that our profession has needed for some time, because you're right. Most businesses nowadays, at least really, really competitive ones, and certainly in the legal profession, the notion of a 9 to 5 Monday to Friday, it's effectively non-existent. But things that I've noticed that have been really, really good changes in doing what I do, and at least in speaking to a number of my colleagues and other lawyers in the profession, is some of the flexibility that's all of a sudden built in now. I mean, our courts, for the most part, still remain closed. So a lot of appearances have been occurring over Zoom. Well, there's fantastic benefits to that. I mean, often, for example, if I have to go to court to try and book a motion date, going to what's called civil practice court. I mean, I can sit in civil practice court sometimes for an hour and a half before I have an opportunity to sort of speak to my matter, which ultimately could take 5 minutes. Doing that over Zoom saves so much time. First of all, I'm not having to waste time getting to and from court. I'm not having to waste time sitting at court. That means I can do other things. It also means that clients can save the money and not having to pay me for that wasted time. These are great benefits that can be passed on to the consumer simply by integrating some technology that frankly has existed for some time now. This isn't novel. This isn't, we're not turning a page in terms of some new technological revolution, but it's great to see the legal profession and some of the other industries starting to find some flexibility in how things are done. Client meetings being virtual. And, let's think about that for a second. I was speaking with a good friend of mine who's a psychotherapist. Typically speaking, he meets with all of his clients in an office, in that very sort of traditional notion of what meeting with a therapist looks like, right? You're in a nice, calm, comfortable office in a one-on-one with your therapist, talking about whatever it is that you're talking about. Well, as he sort of explained to me, of course, they're not meeting in the office right now. So all of his sessions have gone virtual. And initially, he said he lost some clients over that because, there were those clients who were insistent upon the more traditional patient-therapist relationship. But he said that over time, a lot of those clients have come back and he's gained a lot of new ones. And this makes perfect sense to me, Cam. I mean, imagine if you were meeting with a therapist that you didn't know to talk about some very personal issues. Presumably that's going to cause a certain level of anxiety. Wouldn't it be more comfortable to have that meeting in your own home where you can wear what you're comfortable with? You're in a comfortable space, at least initially. I mean, this sort of seems like no-brainer stuff. And I'm seeing a lot of the same things in doing what I do in my profession, meeting with new clients. Meeting with those new clients over a video call or even just over an audio call puts them at ease, because often, the people that I meet with are coming to me in a state of crisis. They've lost their job, or they've been discriminated against or harassed. And, it's sort of key to be able to put that individual in a situation where they feel as comfortable as possible. So I'm sure you have a number of sort of anecdotes like this, as do, every employer that I've spoken with in virtually every industry. I mean, they've found some keys, some benefits to this. And, I think it's just tip of the iceberg stuff going forward.
I don't think it's universal. I mean, that's the only thing I'll say there, because I do think there are a lot of people that really do value the face-to-face interaction. And I think going to a digital solution sometimes doesn't feel as intimate. I think over time, people are adjusting and getting used to it. I mean, I'm seeing that to the point where, yeah, maybe the benefits outweigh whatever they feel like they're losing in that process. But it is still an adjustment. And I think when I do write that manifesto, there might be part in there on Zoom.
Continue the debate with us on social media. Join us on LinkedIn, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at PR Law Podcast. All one word, PRLAW Podcast. Send us your questions now by email to askus@prlawpodcast.com. That's all one word, askus@prlawpodcast.com, or on social media with the hashtag PRLawPod. That's hashtag PRLAWPOD.
All right, and I think you were going to talk about some of these issues in your legal section here. What haven't you touched on yet?
Well, yeah, I think I'm sorry. It sort of came up and then we just jumped right in, didn't we?
Ewan's a passionate man.
That was
once he got going, he just couldn't stop.
Well, look, you've known me a long time. You know what happens if you wind me up and you get me going. Then there's no stopping it. Yeah, I mean, that was really what I wanted to talk about for our legal segment. Actually, was just that right to refuse work. I think we probably gave a pretty thorough breakdown. But again, just sort of to sum up very, very quickly. Look, if you're unsure, if you think that your employer isn't doing their bit to provide a safe work environment, then yeah, by all means, reach out to some legal counsel to get some advice, regardless of what jurisdiction you find yourself in. I understand that lawyers can be expensive, but an hour of a lawyer's time could potentially be invaluable in terms of giving you some clarity in terms of where you stand vis-a-vis that employment relationship and whether or not it is in fact safe to return and whether or not your employer has been following those guidelines. And, and I think there's just a lot of apprehension and anxiety that builds up for a number of employees around these issues. And again, if all of that can be resolved in an hour of time with good counsel, then frankly, I think that's money well spent.
Yeah, there's a couple of things sort of I wanted to sort of tag on here, which are not directly related, but they're somewhat related. One is Jane Mayer. I'm not sure if you're familiar with her, Uen. She's a longtime journalist. I think she was at the New York Times for a long time. She's at the New Yorker now. She wrote a long piece about the regulations that are being gutted in the United States during COVID-19 pertaining to workplace safety. It's actually a long, well-researched piece, but it focuses on sort of the agriculture industry and sort of chicken farming. And just that, while we've been fighting COVID, that these regulations have been gutted to the degree that there's, COVID is spreading widely through these plants that are mostly, housing or holding migrant workers. Not all of them are there legally. People are getting sick. People are dying. And there's almost no information being provided by the company that runs these factories in many cases. So it is interesting because it is supposed to be that the government or a regulator would step in if there are issues over health and safety. And I think, unfortunately, in some industries in the U.S., that's not happening, at least at the federal level. But then the other thing, I will put a link in the show notes to that piece. The other thing I just wanted to pop back to, Uen, was you mentioned about the online, the Zoom calls. And I think if we're going to talk about this, I think we do have to talk about data privacy and data security, because I think, we've mentioned on this show before that Zoom is arguably the worst in terms of keeping your data secure. I mean, they've been caught repeatedly not actually implementing the security policies that they say they do. We're routing their video calls through servers in China that were being intercepted. I mean, there's all sorts of issues like that around Zoom. But Zoom or not, these are issues. I mean, if you're talking to a therapist in person and you're sharing some very personal things, secrets or very, very private information, that is a concern, because that if hackers are out there or people with nefarious objectives are out there, that would be sort of a prime target to try and either sort of step in to intercept that conversation or to record it or to get a record of it. So, I mean, these are things too that are not worked out yet. I mean, we've had video conferencing for a long time. It's like you mentioned, it's not a new technology, but I feel like because of the pandemic, it's really come to the fore in such a big way, where people who had never used it before are using it. And I do fear when there's new technology like that that's embraced so widely, there's going to be people who get hurt because they're not thinking security, right? Like, it's just not something people think about. And Zoom took on. I mean, people just started installing it without a care in the world. And it wasn't until later that we found out maybe it's not the greatest app to have on your computer.
Yeah, I mean, you make a great point, Cam. And also, when you're sort of pushing this technology, people don't take the time to sort of do that background and research. And again, in sort of an employment context, if your employer effectively says, hey, we're going to have a call over Zoom, that raises a lot of really interesting questions. As an employee, could you refuse to participate in that context on the basis of data privacy concerns? I don't know. That's actually a really, really interesting question. Maybe something we can look at in future episodes. I did want to sort of jump back to something else that you said, though, and that's the issue of migrant workers, because you're absolutely right. This has been a huge issue. It's been a huge issue in Canada here. I mean, we've had more than 1,000 migrant farm workers just in Ontario test positive for COVID. 3 of them have died. And yeah, I mean, the federal government, they provided an aid package to migrant workers to try and cover the costs of hotel rooms and food during 14-day quarantine periods, because the spread among migrant workers has been fast and furious. And it makes perfect sense, right? I mean, you've got a number of people in close quarters working, and we've seen spikes in the United States in the same sort of contexts. And, the other thing that's troubling about that, Cam, is, these are typically individuals who are unfamiliar with the legal system because they're not from the country. They don't necessarily know how things work. They don't necessarily know what health and safety entitlements they have even as migrant workers, or how to engage with the system. Who do they call? How do they, they're certainly not in a position to retain legal counsel more often than not. Who do they call? Who do they ask for help? So it's a huge, huge issue. I think it's going to continue to be a huge issue. And I hope that at the very least, it sort of sheds some light on what's going on in terms of migrant workers, across North America.
Yeah, we talk about, the killing of George Floyd, which is obviously something that's tragic, but we look at the results and the potential for real change as a result of that death. It's not wasting the death if we can make some changes. And I think COVID-19 is kind of the same way. I feel like if we do take these lessons seriously, whether it's workplace safety, working from home, data security, all of these sorts of things, even just gatherings. I saw some video earlier this week of a concert, and I did think, there's, tens of thousands of people close together. No one's wearing a mask. You've got to be thinking anything could spread through there so quickly, but it feels like such a naive time now. And I hope we get back to that at some point or something close to it. But there may be an opportunity here for some real change in the workplace. And that's what I'm sort of hopeful about, especially for migrant workers, because, in the case of the Jane Mayer article, it's in the New Yorker. Again, I will post the link to it. A lot of the workers don't speak English, which is obviously a problem. So they can't even read some of the notices that are being posted there. But then the irony is that their work, because they're sort of at a chicken packing plant, they're declared essential. So, there's some of the lowest paid employees in some of the most dangerous environments, but they have to be working, while a lot of other people are not. And so there's definitely a problem with that. There's multiple layers of problems in that setup. And it's way beyond time before that gets fixed. It needs to be looked at.
Absolutely. This is sort of the pinnacle of precarious employment. And you're right. If this, like a number of other issues we've seen, has the opportunity to get, some print coverage or any coverage, I think that's fantastic, because, the reality is a lot of people they just have no concept of where their fruits and vegetables are coming from, who farmed them. We go to a grocery store, we buy what we need, we go home. We don't really engage in that level of critical thought of what is it that I'm putting in my body? Where did it come from? Who harvested this? We really sort of turn a blind eye to the labor perspective of that. So I hope that we shed some more light on those issues.
Okay, Uen. So in sum, if people feel unsafe in their workplace, if their boss is saying you've got to go back to work, but the employee feels that it is legitimately unsafe, you recommend them spend the money to talk to a lawyer, because it's probably worth it. Otherwise, they do have to go back to work, unfortunately.
Yeah, and look, and if they take the position that they're not interested in seeking out counsel, then speak with a health and safety officer. Contact your Ministry of Labor or whatever the local equivalent is, because again, at least in Canada and the United States, there are health and safety officers virtually in every jurisdiction that you can contact to at least get some clarity, be it on a website or getting somebody on the phone. In terms of what duties and obligations your employer has and what duties and obligations you have as an employee. So there are other avenues. But again, if you're feeling a strong sense of anxiety around these issues, spend an hour, spend an hour with counsel, and get things sorted so you can get back to work or not, as the case may be.
Show your support to the PR and Law podcast by making a one-time donation or setting up a subscription with us on Patreon. Every little bit helps us keep the lights on and bring the show to you each week. If you'd like to chip in, please visit prnlawpodcast.com. That's prnlawpodcast.com. Click support the show. Thanks for helping us out.
There's a couple of things I want to bring up, Uen, in terms of communications. And I think, one of them goes outside communications a little bit more into marketing, but I think it's just such a fascinating case study. But before I get to that, I do want to mention Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. I think she's probably well known enough that people listening to this podcast should be aware of who she is. But if not, yes, she's sort of a young star in the Democratic Party. She was elected for the first time in 2018. And she has made quite a name for herself. But this week, I've seen videos of her, and I think you have too, of some of the speeches that she's given on the Hill. And oftentimes they're quite impressive, actually. They're worth kind of considering and saving. And I think they're often quite biting. But the thing I want to bring up today really is there's another Republican, Representative Ted Yoho, and he's a Tea Party kind of Republican. And basically he sort of passed by Ocasio-Cortez on the steps in Washington. And I mean, obviously they're in different parties. They've got very different worldviews, but he did call her disgusting and out of your freaking mind to her face. And as he was walking away, a reporter and a few other witnesses around said they heard him call her an effing bitch. Not the word effing, though. And it was loud enough that it was heard by many people. And I think a lot of the witnesses felt that he was trying to make it heard by as many people as possible. Obviously, I mean, this is unbecoming of an elected representative sort of in Washington, D.C. The following day, he did speak. He didn't apologize, but he made some kind of bizarre comments that I think are still a bit confusing. So this is a brief part of what he said. No one was accosted, bullied, or attacked. This was a brief policy discussion, plain and simple. And we have our differences. The fact still remains, I am not going to apologize for something I didn't say. And he's referring to the expletive, which he continues to deny that he said. He continued, I cannot apologize for my passion or for loving my God, my family, and my country. The New Yorker mentioned it was unclear who had asked him to apologize for his religious faith, his patriotism, or his love of family. But he was ardent all the same, which I think is a very good point. Ocasio-Cortez did finally speak to this later, and she gave quite a compelling speech on the Hill. And I think the reason that I want to mention this, and because there's often speeches, and you say, why are we sharing this one? And I think it was because she was able to give a speech in an era where we are dealing with, for instance, a president who excels at name calling and bullying, and that has spread to basically political life in the United States and elsewhere to a very high degree. But Ocasio-Cortez was able to speak without using name calling and without, using expletives to make her point. And I just want to play a short clip of what she said here because I think it is quite well done.
Having a daughter does not make a man decent. Having a wife does not make a decent man. Treating people with dignity and respect makes a decent man. And when a decent man messes up, as we all are bound to do, he tries his best and does apologize. Not to save face, not to win a vote. He apologizes genuinely to repair and acknowledge the harm done so that we can all move on.
So there's a long history in the United States of wonderful speeches by senators, by congressmen, by presidents that do live on. And I think it's fair to say, in past generations, there was some very creative use of the language. And it's unfortunately just been dumbed down to such a high degree that this kind of a statement is quite rare now in terms of the effort and the fluidity with which she spoke and the words as well. And I think it was quite effective. And I think it would be helpful, especially in such a polarized time, to have language more like this. It wasn't a direct assault on Ted Yoho. What did you think, Uen?
Well, I mean, it's interesting that of the whole speech, you chose to play that one little clip because, yeah, I watched this and that particular part was the one that frankly resonated with me personally the most because I do have a daughter. I do have a wife. And I'm very, very, very conscious of that all the time in terms of all of my actions and how I conduct myself as a man, be it in a professional context or in a social context. But really, I think that this is sort of the very embodiment of the ad hominem attack, right? Where you attack an individual not for an argument or a position that they represent on a particular issue, but rather for who they are. It's a personal attack. And you're quite right. I think the state of politics in the United States is such that the majority of attacks and commentary we see nowadays are in that regard. They're personal attacks, and they're not attacks on issues and policy. And that's where I sort of really, really take issue with the comments. I mean, look, you don't have to agree with each other's political opinions, and let's have fierce debate around those issues. But really, I mean, let's sort of keep the personal attacks aside. Now, off air before we got going, Cam, I know we had a conversation about, well, was really this just an opportunity to score political points? Right? Was this just AOC getting up and thinking, well, hey, I've got an opportunity here. Let's use this. I've got a platform. Let's try and address this as a larger issue, almost as if she was running for election. And maybe that's the case. But frankly, who cares? Who cares if it's an opportunity to sort of address an issue, and in this case, systemic and adverse discrimination? I mean, I guess there wasn't anything particularly adverse here. I mean, if the comments are as they were made out to be, it's pretty straight up, direct misogyny and discrimination. But this is an issue. It is a larger issue at play in the political sphere and in other spheres as well. So even if it was an opportunity to sort of platform, who cares? Let's use it. Let's go with it, and let's try and make things better.
Yeah, and I want to draw some attention here because first of all, I do encourage you to listen to the entire thing. By you, I mean listeners of this podcast, because it is quite a powerful speech. But I want to break down just a couple of things that she said, sort of in the overall speech and in this little segment here, and why they worked. And I think number one, her message is extremely clear. She sets the stage, she builds the context, and she's making a very pointed point in a very clear way. And number two, I think that clarity and the topic and the way she delivered the speech, which was the cadence was a bit slower, and she gave her sentences and her words a little bit of time to breathe. And that added some power to the speech, I think. So there was sort of a powerful side of it. The other one I think that she had in her favor was the righteousness of this. I think it's very difficult to argue that, men should be throwing around expletives at professional women. So, I mean, she's at the very beginning, before she even starts, I mean, she's got the sort of history on her side. She's already got the sort of socially acceptable position to begin with already. And that's a big leg up, but it's not, it doesn't guarantee that her rebuttal will be effective. It does need these other things. But it is a good leg up. And then also the language is clean. She didn't need to drop in sort of insults or sort of lower level language against Ted Yoho. It was just a very sort of honorable speech. And she was able to do that sort of very creatively, I think, in the way that she put this together. And you mentioned also, like, who cares if this is an opportunity for her to score political points? And I think that is such an important part of this, because you said, if she's doing that, who cares? And that's a luxury that people have when they've got these other factors. If they are making if they are delivering an important message, if that message is righteous, if it's right, if it's clear, if it's powerful, you're right. Then all of the opportunist side it just fades away. And I think a lot of times, even in companies, there's concern over, will this be taken cynically by the media, or will our competitors see this as just an opportunity? And yeah, of course, that is a risk that companies run when they do speeches like this or communications like this, and governments as well. But even so, you can overcome that if your message is powerful, because like you just said, Uen, people will just accept it because the message is so important anyway. And so this is why I think she really hit on these things. And it's such a good lesson in how to handle a difficult situation, because she looks like such a more honorable person compared to Ted Yoho, based on what he said to her in person, and then his comments, which were a non-apology afterwards. And I think she's done such a good job of just drawing that contrast.
Yeah, I agree. Look, and the other thing I really appreciated about this is, at least as far as I could tell, and anybody who listens to the show, if they thought otherwise, let us know. She was, I didn't see her reading. I didn't, there was no idiot monitors, as I like to call them, sort of the teleprompters. She spoke from, off the cuff. Now, I have no doubt that it was a prepared speech in some regard, but it was a prepared speech that she didn't have to read. And even that is such a novelty nowadays. Mm-hmm. It really increases the level of connection that you can have to a speaker. And I was conscious of this as a lawyer as well. You spend enough time in court as a litigator, and you can see the difference of lawyers that come to court that are prepared, that can engage and know their argument and know their fact patterns, and can communicate and answer questions that are posed to them by the judge without having to flip through notes and papers and stare at prepared speeches. And of course, it's more compelling. It's more compelling. It's more compelling as a listener. You feel a sense of connection to the message. You feel that there's a sense of conviction and authenticity attached to the message. And I thought that, I sort of, I really appreciated that, and sort of your comment of, we need to get back to that. This was not the exception, but the norm. You talked about some of the great historical speeches that we've seen in the United States. This used to be the norm, that tradition of great orators. I hope we get back to that. But again, I'm sure that there are those that will listen to this and say, well, you're just clearly a liberal progressive hack. So of course you sort of found the message compelling. This isn't about the political message. It's not about what she said and whether I agree with it or disagree with it. Again, this is about trying to raise the level of discourse in a way that is really, really necessary. And this isn't unique to the United States. We suffer from the same problem here in Canada. We suffer from the same problem in a lot of other countries around the world. And we have to get away from this notion of, I'm going to attack my opponent regardless of what their political views are for who they are. Don't attack them for who they are. That all that shows is weakness and an inability to understand the issues and engage in critical debate. Debate them on the issues. Let's have fierce debate on the issues and the opinions. That's the only way we get to the truth. That's the only way we increase the level of critical thought in our countries, regardless of your views on the political spectrum. Let's get back to that.
Yeah, I wanted to unpack something you mentioned in there, which is her speaking off the cuff. And because this is an issue that communications people deal with all the time. If you've got a CEO or a politician or whomever it might be that you're working for, speech writing is obviously a key part of the job. And I did notice her delivery as well. And I mean, I've seen other speeches of hers. She does refer to notes. I do see her looking down, but she does it, I think, in probably one of the best ways. I mean, it's very difficult for people to memorize a speech. It's something that very few people, I think, can do well. Most people, in my experience, do write them out and then try and, look up as much as possible while delivering that speech to make it seem a little more personal, a little less read out. But what she does is she appears to spend most of her time sort of looking at the audience or the listeners and then glancing down occasionally. Now, I don't know what she has written down, but this is for people who can do this, the best thing to do really is, you would create a framework of the speech. And so you would have a big section saying sort of introduction and then maybe 3 bullets. And they're trigger words. So the bullet, it might say, Yoho on the steps, something that triggers something in her memory that she can then tell that story. And then if she gets lost, she can look down and see the next bullet, which should trigger something in her brain to then tell that story. So it doesn't need to be written out. But that's one good way of doing it if you do have sort of a good speaker who you're writing for. When I worked at the stock exchange, again, the chief executive was Charles Lee, and he did not use anything. He didn't use any notes. He didn't use a written speech, nothing. He just couldn't do it. And I mean, in a way, it was nice because, I didn't have to write as many speeches. But it also sometimes got him into trouble because, sometimes he would go off script into things that we, really didn't want him to say or were not ready to be spoken. I think you probably deal with this as a lawyer too, Uen, when your client sort of starts going down a path you don't think they should go down. It's the same for communications. But it is a skill to be able to do that, to just go up on stage and talk comfortably. And some people are great. And he was electric. When he went on stage, people looked at him. He was funny. He was engaging. And I think if you can do that, it's not like it's just one skill that you sort of should have in your toolbox. It's key to how you can even do business or be successful as an individual. I mean, it's so important. And it's one of those skills that I think probably isn't taught enough. The ability to speak publicly and, deal with complex issues in front of a crowd, take questions, all of that sort of stuff. It can make such a big difference to your career.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. And it's hard to imagine a profession where you wouldn't benefit from an ability to communicate well and to speak publicly and engage in those sorts of discussions. In fact, our culture really disproportionately rewards individuals who are able to do this. I mean, there was a great book written a number of years ago by Susan Cain called Quiet, I believe was the topic, was the title of the book. And she was talking about the power of introverts and how introverts are often left behind in very, very unfair ways because they don't feel the need to constantly put their own opinions forward, and that is often interpreted as them being less intelligent or less capable, when really all of the evidence strongly suggests the opposite. But for whatever reason, we continue to disproportionately reward those individuals who are capable of getting up and speaking publicly. So all the more reason to make sure that you do it well. But also, Cam, you talked about an ability to sort of speak off the cuff. And, we've talked about Trump in this regard, and how, yes, it has gotten him into trouble, but also that this is part of what his base loves, right? That he will get up and he will speak his mind and he will speak off the cuff. And that is, that's something that we haven't really seen politicians do here in Canada. For those who might remember Jean Chrétien, who was a prime minister in the 90s here in Canada, he also had an uncanny ability to do this, to get up and speak off the cuff. And it also would occasionally get him into trouble. But I think that was something that people generally respected and appreciated about his style of politics.
Well, there is an authenticity to it. There is an authenticity to it when you're speaking that way. And I think, people aren't going to like me saying this, but like a Donald Trump speech is very entertaining. And I mean, I had an American friend here, Uen, for a long time. You knew him, Nathan. I mean, he would go home after work and his wife and him would make dinner and leave. This was in 2016, and play a Donald Trump speech from the campaign trail. just as for fun, because it was so crazy, the stuff that he was saying and his sort of diatribes. And, he went down so many different paths in his speech, and like, it was genuine entertainment. And that helped him so much. I mean, that's probably the number one reason he was able to get elected, in fact. And I know people don't like Trump, and fair enough. But his ability to sort of manage the media and speak this way, he is extremely skilled in that area. And it happens to be the one area that we clearly value very highly when we're choosing elected officials.
Yeah, well, and I'm conscious now that we're almost being contradictory, or I was being contradictory, because sort of earlier talking about, AOC's and the idea of sort of raising the level of discourse. And now I'm sort of, singing the praises of an ability to sort of speak off the cuff, but I don't necessarily think that they're mutually exclusive. I think, the former can complement the latter, and vice versa. But that they're both sort of key points that we see in sort of in politics today. And I'm very sort of curious to see where this will go. Culturally, in terms of how we engage with our politicians and what we expect of them going forward, and whether we're going to see, a shift in some ways in terms of how discourse is sort of and speeches are given politically. I suspect we're probably going to see more of the same for some time, but they are sort of two really interesting examples of how you can convey a message.
It's interesting. I was putting together just some thoughts because, I've had relatives or friends back in Canada say, like, if they wanted to move to Hong Kong and work somewhere, like, what do they need? What kind of background do they need? If they want to get a job, this and that. And I realized that I was kind of giving the same advice, no matter what sort of background the person had or what kind of job they wanted to get. And, one of them was being able to write. And it's like, you think, well, okay, if someone wants to be an accountant or something, like, why do they need to be able to write well? But it's like speaking. In fact, I think it's even more so than speaking. It's a core competency that is on display all the time, because you have to email people all the time, your boss, your colleagues, you've got to apply for jobs. You've got to, so many different things. And how you are able to compose your thoughts and put them in a way that's persuasive and compelling. If you can do that, that can open all kinds of doors for you. Eventually you're going to have the ability to sort of do the work. But if you have this skill, it's going to put you in a position, most likely, where you will have the chance to prove if you can do the work or not. It helps open that first door for you. And yeah, it's something I recommend for everyone.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. We see that a lot in the legal profession. I think of articling interviewing, new students coming out of law school that are looking for entry level jobs. And, those initial interviews can be very deceiving, right? The individual who perhaps is incredibly articulate, and can really engage in some sort of compelling conversation right out of the gate. Those are not necessarily easy things to do, and they can certainly sway the decision-making process in terms of who you're going to hire and who you're not going to hire. But the reality is that, that's only one aspect of what lawyers need to do in terms of meeting with a client and connecting with that client and being able to listen and understand their position. Another aspect of what we do, and as any lawyer will tell you, we're effectively professional readers and professional writers. That's what we do. So, your ability to write well, your ability to read and identify issues really has absolutely nothing with your ability to engage in conversation or be friendly to a new client. And often, again, I think the latter, those individuals are often pushed off to the wayside. And I think that that's a mistake. I think that, those skill sets that you've talked about, being a great writer, being a good reader and being able to identify issues, those skills are just as valuable and, frankly, often far more valuable than those sort of traditional extroverted characteristics of being sociable and a good talker.
We're running up against the clock a little bit here, so I want to get to this, Ewan. Tell me if this rings any bells.
Release the Kraken.
All right. I think some people...
I saw this too. I saw this as well.
Some people may think, what on earth is a Kraken? What is this? This is Seattle's new NHL ice hockey team, which was announced. The name was announced this week. And I bring it up. I mentioned off the top of the show that I want to talk about something that wasn't directly related to communications, at least not the corporate communications, but more on the marketing side. And I mean, I have to say up front, like I'm less interested in marketing. It's not something I've ever been particularly good at. I'm more on the corporate side, but I think this is a really fascinating case study. So, I mean, a bit of background. I mean, obviously the team was awarded, or Seattle was awarded an NHL team at least a year ago, longer than a year ago, I think. And there's been a long wait to figure out what the name would be. And there's been a lot of, sort of names thrown out there to consider. And Kraken was one of them. And Kraken's an odd name. Do you know what it is, Ewan?
Do I know what a Kraken is?
Yeah.
I mean, isn't a Kraken that massive beast of the sea? It's effectively like a giant octopus.
Yeah, like a giant squid. But it is very sort of Pacific Northwest style, and it's unlike a lot of other team names. So, I mean, it's a big risk using this name, but I'm interested from the business side, because to name a professional sports team something like Kraken, that is a gamble. It's kind of a big gamble, actually, because it's so off the board, and it's unlike what I normally see. I mean, oftentimes in these situations, especially when you're dealing with something creative, you want to get something that is definitely creative, but not too far out there, because once you do that, you're running the risk of ridicule or people turning against you, and it can move from sort of like an awkward announcement into a crisis pretty quickly if that happens. So I sort of admire the forward-thinking, risk-taking part of this, and the franchise is actually run by Todd Lewicki. I'm not sure if you remember that name, Ewan, but actually he was part of the team that set up the Toronto Raptors and came up with the Raptors name in the NBA. Yeah. So I just want to play a quick clip. This is Tom Manek. He's a sports business expert. He's been involved in some of these incidents or naming teams as well. These are some of his thoughts on the Kraken.
They've gone off the grid, no question, with an unusual name, a name that wouldn't have been handicapped maybe a year and a half ago. But the teasing of, the fact that this name was coming, and was it Kraken? Was it Sockeyes? What was it going to be? That led to a lot of retailer interest as well. And I think you're going to see a very strong follow through, because in my view, they've hit it out of the park in terms of being original in a time where it's so hard to be original, given the fact that so many good names have been taken, and you don't necessarily want to borrow from names that are popular in other leagues. Certainly it's a risk, like the Toronto Raptors were back in the day, but a lot of the similar principles, including the fact that kids are going to be all over it.
Now, there's a downside here, Ewan. I think you've probably heard them. I mean, if the team name is called Kraken, what do you call their fans? Crackheads? Do we call their rink Crack House? I mean, these are things that could come up, and there's certainly a risk. And so I want to again throw to Tom Manek on exactly this point.
I think ultimately the uniqueness will override it. And also, Farhan, I mean, it is one of the vulnerabilities of the name, and they certainly would have studied it. It's certainly something that I considered in terms of my own sort of belief that was the direction that they were going to go. And I know Todd well enough to know that it would have been all about storytelling. It would have been about how do you come up with a name that has a certain mythology about it, and how do you come up with a name and a look that appeals to kids, but also young people of all ages, if you know what I mean. And I think those principles will overridingly overcome the fact that there will be that crackhead reference used pejoratively to fans of the Kraken, for sure.
I think he's right, though. They hit it out of the park on this. I watched the unveil video. They actually released a video a day in advance that was quite well put together, and then the announcement. And it has shot to stardom already in Seattle. It's already vaulted to the number one sports logo in the city. I mean, Seattle's got a lot of sports teams. I mean, they've got the Seattle Seahawks. They've got, the Sonics are not there anymore. But to vault to number one that quickly on announcement is quite good. And I think I also think it's about time. Something really original, something different, something, it's a mythological character, obviously, but very, very creative. And so I wanted to bring that up as just sort of a case study on marketing and taking a bit of risk. And when that risk can pay off, there's great positive energy around it.
Hey, I thought it was kind of cool too. I saw the S logo anyway. I thought it looked fantastic. And, and you can't think about it without not thinking about the geographic location of Seattle. So, I mean, those two things will become somewhat synonymous, which I think is clever. I risky, sure. I don't know. But I mean, I'm sure that they will, if they are called crackheads, I'm sure they'll find a way to reclaim it in a positive twist. I mean, never underestimate the uncanny ability of sports fans to sort of creatively warp these things into something that they can get behind.
Well, what's interesting on this point too in marketing? I mean, we say, okay, it might be crackheads or if the arena is called the crack house by, in a sort of sarcastic way. It is possible that those two terms are used and that they're used so much that they kind of lose their other meaning. I mean, I think a little bit about when iPad was introduced. I mean, it was ridiculed, that name. People said, how can you call it a pad? Like, that's a feminine hygiene product. And there was a lot of talk about that at the time, but then it went away and now nobody brings that up. I know that crackhead and crack house is a little different in terms of the, the descriptive nature and what it means. But I do think there's a possibility that it just sort of fades over time as well. So on that note, Uen, I will put a link in there to the video. I know you mentioned you saw the logo, Uen. Actually, the animation of the logo sort of creating is quite stunning as well. They really have done a good job. So I will link to all of that stuff. Uen, we're wrapping up here. What would you like to share in terms of some recommended content to dive into this week?
Yeah, so this was an article that a former colleague of mine, she sent to me, and I'm very thankful that she did. It's a Slate article called "The Class of RBG," as in Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and this is an amazing article. It tells the story of the 9 other women in the Harvard law class of 1959, as told by those women, the ones that are still alive anyway, their families, and Ruth Bader Ginsburg herself. And the story sort of opens up with this really, really interesting story about the early days of the class. And all of the women were gathered at the dean's home for a dinner party. And the dean asks each of the women in the class to stand up and explain, who they are and why they've taken the spot of a man at Harvard. So this is what the dean says. And somewhat infamously, Ruth Bader Ginsburg stands up and she explains that she was at Harvard because she wanted to learn more about her husband's work. Obviously, very, very tongue-in-cheek. Another woman, also equally tongue-in-cheek, joked that she was there to meet a husband. But really, Cam, the story of these 9 women, it's amazing. And the article dives really, really deep. It's a long-form article examining what these women went through in law school, the struggles that they had to sort of secure good employment after the fact, despite being top students at Harvard, all of just the systemic racism that existed in the legal profession against women. It's a really, really amazing read. One of the women even talks about she was pregnant at the time, and the lecture hall where obviously all the students would go for class, there wasn't a women's washroom. The women had to leave the building to go to the washroom, and she was pregnant at the time. So she came to an arrangement with the men to where she would put a sign on the door to let them know that there was a woman in the washroom, and to stay out until she had finished.
This isn't that long ago,
No, not at all. It really isn't, and to think, I started law school. I was in 2005, and I believe our class breakdown was 51% women and 49% men. So, obviously things have changed a very, very great deal. My contracts class and employment law class were taught by women, which of course was just unheard of at the time, back in 59. Anyway, a really, really great article. It's also a 2-part podcast. I have gone through the first part, and highly, highly recommend it.
Oh, that reminds me too. I'm absolutely immersed in the podcast Guru, which is done by Wondery. I cannot believe I didn't know about Wondery. I ended up reading about them on a website that I write for called 9 to 5 Mac, and they were looking at podcast networks. Wondery does some incredible podcasts. They are sort of true crime, or they are sort of case studies, or they've got a wide range. But the one I'm currently into is Guru, and it looks at sort of a self-help guru and the extremes to which he put his followers through certain actions and acts that ended up with some big consequences. It really is kind of a riveting show. But the main thing I wanted to mention just before we wrap up, an article in Forbes. It's also a long form article. It's called I Scream, You Scream, the Meltdown at the Museum of Ice Cream. I don't know if you've heard about this, Ewan, but there was a museum, and I'm using scare quotes here, which was basically sort of an Instagram hall. There were multiple rooms that you would go in, and there was, a big pool of sprinkles that you could dive into and take a picture. And there's all kinds of sort of stuff like this that you would use for Instagram. So obviously it's a huge hit with the millennial groups and younger, also the Gen Z folks. And it was built into this quite successful project with their main story in New York City. And it was built by a woman called Mary Ellis Bunn, and she is just 28 years old. And at the height, she compared herself to Walt Disney. I mean, she felt that she was at that level, and that what she was creating were these magical experiences where young people could go and spend time and just really, really have a lot of fun. But it broke that she was really not a kind boss, and some of the abuse that she put on her staff until everything unraveled. And I talked earlier just about like looking at good case studies. I think the Seattle Kraken, that's a positive sort of marketing case study just based on the outcome. This is such a good case study to take a look at as something that ends very poorly, and some of the things that business owners might want to think about when they are growing their business, and some paths that they should not go down that could be quite consequential. It's a fascinating read. I wasn't familiar with the Museum of Ice Cream. I certainly am now. I see mentions of it here and there, but just a really compelling story.
Great. I'll have to check that out too.
Right. So send me the links, Ewan, the ones that you talked about. I'll put those into the show notes, and that'll be all good. Anything else, Ewan? You want to pass along any messages? Anything else you want to raise before we wrap it up?
No, only that, we don't have time. We sort of touched on it earlier. I'll put a link in the show notes. Another great article I read in the Globe and Mail called The Great Reset, and just talking about two major waves of layoffs around COVID. So, the first being the direct result of COVID and unique to the pandemic, but the second wave dealing with sort of underlying economic drag. And this is where we're going to start to see some real revolutionary change. In fact, it almost is referred to as like a new industrial revolution, and just massive reform across industry in terms of how business is conducted, and the way that employers hire and structure their businesses going forward. So we'll put a link to that as well.
I think we've barely started some of the changes that are going to happen as a result of COVID-19. I think in a lot of parts of the world, including here in Hong Kong, it's getting worse. Oh, I should mention too, before we close up, we've talked a lot about Vietnam's successful track record. They ended up with a new case this week, and they have no idea how this person got COVID-19 because their borders have been closed, and he had not traveled in something like 10 months. So it's very, very strange. They're back on with one case. So I mean, we're still. I just feel, I've said this before, I think we're still closer to the beginning than the end of what COVID-19 is going to do. It's going to be with us a while. I think the changes. There's some big changes still coming to the future of work and many other things. So I think we'll have lots of material, Ewan, in future shows.
Great. Well, let's leave it on that happy note then, shall we?
Yes. So stay safe, everybody. That's the main thing. If you like the show, please tell a friend. It is good to get the word out there. We definitely love new listeners. You can also follow us on social media. You'll get an update when we drop a new show. And also if there's any updates to some of the stories that we talk about, we often post them there. And you can also listen to us on YouTube. And subscribe that way, and Patreon and the website, blah, 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 et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So this is Cam with Ewan signing off from the PR and Law Podcast. We'll see you next week.
This has been the PR and Law Podcast with Cam McMurtry and Ewan Christie. If you enjoyed the show, please share it with a friend or leave a review. You can also join us on LinkedIn, Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook by following our account at PR Law Podcast. That's all one word, PRLAW Podcast. Thanks for your support.